My husband walked through our front door with another woman on his arm, sat her at my dining table, and told me I should be grateful she liked me. I remember the exact time because I looked at the clock hanging above the stove. 6:14 p.m. It was a Thursday in early September, and I had just finished making chicken noodle soup. Nothing fancy. Just the kind of dinner people who've been married 14 years make on a weeknight. The windows were open. A warm Indiana breeze drifted through the kitchen. I was setting out bowls when I heard David's truck pull into the driveway. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I heard laughter. A woman's laughter. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked toward the front hallway. The door opened. David stepped inside, and right behind him was a tall blonde woman in a cream-colored dress carrying a designer handbag that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. For a second, I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong house. David smiled casually. "Hey, Susan." Like nothing was strange. Like he hadn't just brought another woman into our home. The woman glanced around the entryway. "Oh, this place is cute." Cute. We'd spent 12 years paying for this house. I looked at David. "Who is this?" The woman answered before he could. "I'm Vanessa." Then she extended her hand, as if we were meeting at church, as if she wasn't standing 3 feet inside my front door beside my husband. I didn't take her hand. David sighed dramatically. "Can we sit down?" I still hadn't moved. "What is going on?" His expression hardened. That was the moment I knew. Not because of what he said, because of what he didn't say. No apology. No guilt. Nothing. Just annoyance. The 3 of us ended up in the kitchen. Or rather, Vanessa sat down. At my chair. At my table. While I remained standing. David leaned against the counter. "Susan, I've been seeing Vanessa for several months." The words landed quietly. No explosion. No dramatic music. Just a sentence. One ordinary sentence that shattered 14 years of marriage. I stared at him. Several months? I thought about all the evenings he'd worked late. All the business trips. All the weekends he claimed he was meeting investors. The lies suddenly fit together like pieces of a puzzle I'd never wanted to solve. Vanessa crossed one leg over the other. She looked completely comfortable. Like she'd rehearsed this, David continued. "I think it's best if we're adults about this. Adults." I almost laughed. Instead, I folded the dish towel in my hands. Again. And again. Because if I stopped moving, I wasn't sure what I'd do. "You're leaving me?" I asked. "I'm moving on." The way he said it made it sound like he was upgrading his phone plan. Vanessa smiled slightly. Not enough to be obvious, just enough. Then David delivered the line that still makes me shake my head when I think about it. "Vanessa's father owns half this city." I blinked. "What?" He nodded toward her. "So don't make things difficult." Vanessa looked pleased. David continued. "Trust me, you don't want to make her angry." For a moment I wondered if I was having some kind of stroke. The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. My husband was introducing his mistress like she was royalty. And somehow I was supposed to be intimidated. I looked at Vanessa. Then at David. Neither one seemed embarrassed. That hurt more than the affair itself. The complete lack of shame. I expected tears. I expected screaming. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Maybe because the situation was so ridiculous. Maybe because some part of me had already accepted what my heart hadn't caught up with yet. I set the dish towel down. "Excuse me." David frowned. "That's it." I nodded. "That's it." Then I walked upstairs. I heard him mutter something behind me. I didn't care. The bedroom door closed softly. I sat on the edge of the bed. And finally my hands started shaking. The house suddenly felt unfamiliar. Every picture frame. Every piece of furniture. Every vacation souvenir. 14 years. Gone. I stared at the wedding photo on my dresser. David and I looked so young. So certain. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was realizing that the man downstairs wasn't the man in that photograph anymore. Maybe he hadn't been for years. My phone sat beside me. I picked it up. Put it down. Picked it up again. For most of my adult life, I avoided involving my parents in my problems. Especially my father. Not because he wasn't supportive. Because he was. Sometimes too supportive. When I was younger, Dad had a habit of solving problems before people even realized there was a problem. Growing up, my family lived differently than most people. Very differently. But my parents worked hard to keep me grounded. By the time I met David at a charity fundraiser in Indianapolis, I had already learned something important. People treated you differently when they knew how much money your family had. Some became overly impressed. Others became resentful. Very few remained normal. So I never told David everything. He knew my parents were comfortable. He knew they lived in Ohio. He knew Dad worked in business. That was it. He never asked many questions, and over time the subject rarely came up. Looking back, maybe that should have concerned me. I opened my messages, found Dad's contact. For nearly a minute I stared at the screen. Then I typed 2 letters. SOS. Nothing else. Just that. I hit send. The message delivered instantly. I placed the phone beside me. Part of me wondered if I'd made a mistake. Maybe I should handle this myself. Maybe I should... The phone rang. 5 minutes. Exactly 5 minutes, Dad, I answered. Hi. My voice cracked. There was a brief silence. Then his voice came through. Calm. Steady. The same voice that had guided me through every crisis since childhood. Susan. That was all he said. And somehow hearing my name nearly broke me. I swallowed hard. Dad. Another pause. Then his tone changed. Not louder. Just sharper. Protective. The way it always became when someone hurt one of his children. Susan, he said quietly. Tell me exactly who needs to learn a lesson. For the first time all evening I smiled, because somewhere downstairs my husband thought he had all the power, and he had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. My father didn't raise his voice during that phone call. That was what worried me. People who didn't know Richard Bennett often assumed he was gentle because he spoke softly. Employees loved him, neighbors liked him, waiters remembered him because he always asked their names. But I knew something most people didn't. The calmer Dad became, the more serious the situation usually was. After I explained everything, there was silence on the line. I sat on the edge of my bed listening to the faint sounds downstairs. A cabinet door closed. Vanessa laughed again. Dad finally spoke. Are they still in your house? Yes. Another pause. Do you want me there? The offer was immediate. No hesitation. No questions. Just support. I closed my eyes. Part of me desperately wanted him to show up. The other part still couldn't accept that my marriage had collapsed in a single evening. No, I said quietly. Not yet. All right. You aren't angry. Dad actually laughed. Oh, Susan. That answer told me everything. He was furious. The next morning I barely slept. Around 6:30 I walked downstairs expecting awkwardness. Instead, I found a note on the kitchen counter. Gone for breakfast. David. No apology. No explanation. Nothing. I made coffee and stood by the window watching the neighborhood wake up. Kids waiting for school buses. A man walking his golden retriever. A delivery truck dropping off packages. Normal life continuing while mine felt like it had exploded. Around 9 o'clock, my friend Karen called. Karen and I had known each other for nearly 20 years. She heard something was wrong immediately. What happened? I didn't plan to tell her. Then suddenly I told her everything. Every detail. The affair. The mistress. The humiliation. The ridiculous comment about owning half the city. When I finished, Karen was silent for several seconds. Then she said exactly what I needed to hear. Susan, none of this sounds like your fault. I stared into my coffee. I keep wondering what I missed. You missed a liar. Simple. Direct. Comforting. Unfortunately, reality became uglier over the next week. David stopped pretending. Vanessa started appearing everywhere. Restaurants. Business events. Social media. Friends began hearing rumors before I even filed for divorce. According to David's version of events, our marriage had been struggling for years. According to David's version, I was distant, uninterested, cold. It amazed me how quickly someone could rewrite history. One afternoon, I visited our attorney. Well, technically my attorney. Dad had recommended a law firm in Indianapolis. I expected discussions about property division and paperwork. Instead, the meeting took a very different turn. Attorney Michael Sanders spent nearly 2 hours reviewing financial records. The deeper he looked, the more serious his expression became. Finally, he removed his glasses. Susan, I need to ask something. My stomach tightened. Okay. Did you authorize these loans? He turned his laptop toward me. I examined the documents. Several signatures appeared at the bottom. My signatures. Or at least they looked like mine. Except they weren't. My blood ran cold. No. Michael leaned back. Are you certain? Absolutely. He opened another file. And another. And another. More signatures. More authorizations. More financial transactions. None approved by me. By the end of the meeting, I felt physically sick. David hadn't just cheated. He had apparently been using assets connected to a trust established by my grandfather years ago. Not huge amounts, but enough to create serious problems. Enough to potentially involve fraud. I drove home in silence. The betrayal suddenly felt larger, deeper, more calculated. That evening I called Dad. He listened carefully. When I finished, he asked one question. "What do your attorneys recommend?" "They want a forensic accountant." "Good." I hesitated. "Dad." "Yes." "How long have you suspected David wasn't who he claimed to be?" Silence, then a long sigh. "Longer than I'd like to admit." I wasn't surprised. Fathers notice things, especially fathers who spent decades negotiating billion-dollar deals. Dad continued. "I hoped I was wrong." So did I. For the first time during the entire conversation, his voice softened. "I'm sorry, sweetheart." That nearly made me cry. Not because I needed sympathy, because I knew he meant it. A few days later, something happened that made me laugh for the first time since everything fell apart. A genuine laugh. The kind that catches you by surprise. Karen sent me screenshots from social media. David and Vanessa had attended a charity gala downtown. David was posing beside local business owners and developers. Under one photograph, someone commented, "Is it true Vanessa's father owns half the city?" Another person responded, "Half the city." A third person replied, "He owns 3 car dealerships." I stared at my phone. Then I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my tea. 3 dealerships. That was the terrifying empire I'd supposedly been warned about. I wasn't mocking honest success. 3 dealerships is impressive. But it wasn't exactly the dynasty David had described in my kitchen. Apparently, even some local business leaders found the claim amusing. The screenshots continued. More comments. More jokes. One person asked whether half the city included the airport parking garage. I laughed until tears appeared in my eyes. It felt wonderful. Not because David looked foolish. Because for a few minutes I wasn't heartbroken. I was just amused. That feeling didn't last. A week later, another meeting with my attorney changed everything again. Michael placed several folders on the conference table. "We've identified another issue." My stomach immediately dropped. "What now?" He exchanged a glance with one of his associates. Then he opened a property report. The address looked familiar. Very familiar. I read it twice, then a third time. It was one of David's biggest commercial development projects. A project he'd bragged about constantly for the past year. Michael folded his hands. "This property recently changed ownership." "What does that mean?" "It means the company that now controls the property has significant leverage." I frowned. "What company?" Michael smiled slightly. Then he mentioned a corporate name I knew instantly. One of Dad's companies. I blinked. "What?" Michael nodded. "The acquisition happened months ago." I sat speechless. David had no idea. For nearly a year he'd been building plans on land now controlled by one of the corporations connected to my father's business empire. The irony was almost unbelievable. That evening I drove to Ohio and met Dad at his house. The same house David believed belonged to a retired businessman. Dad and I sat on the back porch overlooking the lake. The sun was setting. For a while neither of us spoke. Finally I broke the silence. "You bought his project?" Dad chuckled. "No." "Then what happened?" "We acquired the parent company." I laughed despite myself. Of course they had. That was how billion-dollar corporations worked. Not through dramatic takeovers. Through quiet transactions most people never noticed. Dad sipped his coffee. "David thinks he's operating on a very large stage." I stared across the water. The evening breeze moved through the trees. For the first time in weeks I felt something besides pain. I felt perspective. Dad looked at me. Not as a chairman, not as a billionaire, just as my father. Then he said something I would remember for a very long time. "Your husband thinks he's playing chess." I smiled faintly. Dad returned the smile. "He doesn't realize who's holding the board." And at that moment neither of us knew the biggest surprise was still waiting ahead. 3 weeks after David brought Vanessa into my house, I received an invitation that nearly made me choke on my coffee. It arrived in a thick cream-colored envelope. Expensive paper. Gold lettering. The kind of invitation people order when they want everyone to know they've spent money. I was sitting at my kitchen table when I opened it. Karen was visiting. She watched my expression change. "What is it?" I handed her the card. She read it, then blinked, then read it again. Oh my God. Across the top were the words, "Celebrating the future of David Collins and Vanessa Harper, an engagement celebration." My divorce wasn't even finalized. I laughed once, a short, stunned laugh. Karen looked horrified. "He's actually doing this." Apparently he was. The event was scheduled for Saturday evening at one of the most exclusive country clubs outside Indianapolis. The guest list included local business owners, investors, politicians, and dozens of people David desperately wanted to impress. Karen shook her head. The nerve. The truth was, I wasn't even angry at first. I was exhausted. The previous weeks had drained me emotionally. Some mornings I woke up forgetting what had happened. Then reality returned, like stepping into cold water. I wasn't sleeping well. Food tasted bland. My concentration disappeared. I'd walk into rooms and forget why I was there. For 14 years I'd built my life around a marriage. Now I was trying to imagine a future without it. At 42, that felt harder than I expected. People talk about starting over like it's exciting. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's terrifying, especially when you didn't choose it. A few days after the invitation arrived, I stopped at a grocery store near Carmel. Nothing special. Just a normal Tuesday. I was comparing pasta sauces when I noticed two women from a local charity committee whispering nearby. One glanced toward me, then quickly looked away. I knew that look. Most adults do. The rumor look, the gossip look. I pushed my cart down another aisle. For a moment I considered leaving everything behind and driving home. Instead I finished shopping. Because life keeps moving, even when your heart would rather hide. That evening I sat on my back patio with a glass of iced tea. The sun was setting. The neighborhood was quiet. My phone rang. Dad, how are you holding up? I smiled. He asked that every few days. I'm okay. That wasn't very convincing. I laughed. No, it wasn't. He let the silence sit comfortably between us. Then he said something unexpected. Our investigators found additional information. I sat upright. What kind of information? About Vanessa. That got my attention. For several seconds I listened carefully. And then Dad shared something neither of us had anticipated. Apparently Vanessa hadn't been nearly as devoted to David as she pretended. According to information gathered by attorneys and investigators, she'd entered the relationship believing David was significantly wealthier than he actually was. David had exaggerated. A lot. Properties he didn't own. Investments he didn't control. Business ventures that weren't nearly as successful as he'd claimed. I stared across my backyard. You're kidding! I wish I were. A laugh escaped me. Not because the situation was funny, because it was absurd. David had left his wife for a woman who believed a fictional version of him. The irony was almost beautiful. Does she know? Not yet. After we ended the call, I sat there for a long time thinking. One question kept returning. How much of my marriage had been real? I hated that question. Because there was no answer. People aren't entirely good or entirely bad. David wasn't a monster when we met. He'd been funny, ambitious, kind to my mother, patient with my younger brother. The man I married had existed. At least I believed he had. Somewhere along the way, greed and ego had taken over. That realization hurt more than anger ever could. The following week became a whirlwind of meetings. Attorneys, accountants, documents, evidence. I learned more about financial investigations than I ever wanted to know. Every few days another discovery surfaced. Additional loans, misrepresentations, missing disclosures. Nothing dramatic enough for television, but serious enough in real life. Meanwhile, David continued preparing for his engagement celebration. Social media updates appeared constantly. Photos, announcements, smiling faces, expensive restaurants, weekend trips, public declarations of happiness. The harder he tried to appear successful, the more desperate it looked. One afternoon I met Dad and several attorneys at a conference room in Columbus. Stacks of documents covered the table. For hours we reviewed evidence. When the meeting ended, everyone filed out except Dad and me. The room finally became quiet. I looked at the folders, the reports, the signatures, the proof. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me. What if this is too much? Dad studied me. What do you mean? What if exposing everything ruins him? For the first time all day, nobody spoke. I stared at the table. The question sounded ridiculous after everything David had done. Yet it was real. Part of me still remembered birthdays, road trips, Christmas mornings, the years before everything went wrong. Dad leaned back in his chair. Then he said something simple, something that changed how I viewed everything afterward. Revenge isn't the goal. I looked up. The truth is, that was it. No dramatic speech, no lecture. Just one sentence. And suddenly I understood. The purpose wasn't destruction. The purpose was accountability. David's choices created the consequences, not me. A strange sense of peace settled over me. The next major surprise arrived 2 days before the engagement celebration. I was at home organizing paperwork when Karen called. She sounded excited. "You are not going to believe this." "What happened?" "I just heard from someone on the planning committee." I sat down. "Okay." Karen practically laughed into the phone. "Your father sent an RSVP." I blinked. "What?" "Not only an RSVP," she paused dramatically. "He plans to attend." I nearly dropped the phone. Dad had never mentioned this. Not once. Not even hinted. I called him immediately. He answered on the second ring. "Dad?" "Hello, sweetheart." "Are you going to David's engagement party?" A brief silence. Then I heard amusement in his voice. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I was invited." I rubbed my forehead. "You know exactly what I mean." He chuckled. Maybe for the first time in my life, my father sounded mischievous. "I thought it might be interesting." "Interesting." The chairman of a billion-dollar corporation was describing an upcoming train wreck as interesting. I couldn't help laughing. "Does David know who you are?" "No." "Does Vanessa?" "No." I laughed harder. Dad joined in. For several moments, neither of us could stop. Finally, I caught my breath. "This is unbelievable." "Perhaps." Then his tone softened. "You don't have to attend if you don't want to." I looked around my quiet house. The house where my marriage ended. The house where I'd cried. Questioned myself. Started rebuilding. "No," I said. "I think I do." After we hung up, I sat alone in silence. Saturday was coming. The engagement celebration was coming. And somewhere out there, David Collins was preparing for the biggest night of his new life. He believed everyone would be applauding his future. He believed his carefully constructed image was secure. What he didn't know was that an invitation had already landed in the hands of the one person capable of exposing everything. And in less than 48 hours, the room he expected to impress would become the room where every lie finally caught up with him. Saturday arrived cold and gray. The kind of Indiana fall evening where the sky looks like it's made of steel. I spent most of the day wondering whether I should go. Not because I was afraid of David. Because I wasn't sure I wanted to relive the humiliation. Several times I considered staying home, ordering takeout, watching old movies, pretending none of it mattered. But deep down I knew I needed to be there. Not for revenge. For closure. Around 5 o'clock, Karen arrived at my house. She walked in carrying 2 garment bags. "You are absolutely not backing out." I laughed. Was I that obvious? Completely. Over the next hour, she helped me get ready. Nothing flashy. Nothing designed to compete with Vanessa. A simple navy dress. Pearl earrings my mother gave me years ago. Comfortable heels. For the first time in weeks, I looked in the mirror and recognized myself. Not the woman David had abandoned. Not the woman people whispered about. Just me. That felt surprisingly powerful. The country club sat just outside Indianapolis. Beautiful property. Stone entrance. Manicured grounds. Large ballroom overlooking a golf course. As Karen and I pulled into the parking lot, luxury vehicles filled nearly every space. Mercedes, BMWs, Cadillacs, a few Bentleys. Clearly, David had succeeded in attracting the audience he wanted. Inside servers carried trays of champagne. Soft piano music played. People mingled beneath crystal chandeliers. Everywhere I looked, there were familiar faces. Business owners. Community leaders. Former friends. A few people noticed me immediately. Conversations paused. Heads turned. The room's energy shifted. Being the ex-wife at your husband's engagement party isn't exactly a comfortable experience. Karen squeezed my arm. "You okay?" I nodded. "Ask me again in an hour." Near the center of the ballroom stood David and Vanessa. David wore an expensive suit. Vanessa wore a sparkling silver dress. Both looked delighted with themselves. As guests arrived, they greeted everyone like celebrities walking a red carpet. For a moment, I simply watched. And something unexpected happened. I didn't feel jealous. I didn't feel angry. I mostly felt tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of the performance. Tired of pretending appearances mattered more than character. Eventually, David spotted me. His smile faltered. Only briefly. Then he recovered. He approached confidently. "Well," I waited. He glanced at Karen, then back at me. "I'm surprised you came. I'm surprised you invited me." A few nearby guests pretended not to listen. David smiled tightly. "Thought it was the mature thing to do." Karen nearly choked, trying not to laugh. Before I could respond, Vanessa appeared beside him. She looked me up and down. Not openly rude, just enough. "Hello, Susan." "Vanessa." An awkward silence followed. Finally, David cleared his throat. "We're very happy." I nodded. "That's what matters." The expression on his face suggested that wasn't the answer he'd expected. He wanted a reaction, a scene, some proof that he'd won. Instead, I picked up a glass of sparkling water and walked away. For the next hour, I spoke with old friends. Some apologized for believing rumors. Others admitted they'd suspected something wasn't right. Several people quietly shared concerns about David's recent behavior. Apparently, I wasn't the only one noticing cracks in his story. Then, shortly after 7:30, everything changed. The ballroom entrance opened. At first, nobody paid much attention. Another guest arriving late. Nothing unusual. Then whispers began. One voice. Then another. Then several more. Heads turned toward the doorway. I followed their gaze, and immediately understood why. My father had arrived. Not alone. Behind him were several senior executives from his corporation. People regularly featured in business magazines. People recognizable throughout the Midwest. The effect was immediate. Conversation stopped. The room seemed to freeze. David looked confused. Vanessa looked confused. Most of the guests looked stunned. Dad entered calmly. No dramatic entrance. No grand announcement. Just quiet confidence. The kind that comes from decades of success. I watched David glance toward nearby investors, then toward local business owners. Many of them suddenly looked nervous, or impressed, or both. Dad walked directly across the ballroom, past the buffet tables, past the bar, past David, past Vanessa, straight toward me. I felt my throat tighten. For a brief moment, I wasn't 42 years old. I was 12 again. The little girl whose father always showed up when she needed him. Dad smiled, then wrapped me in a hug. A real hug. The kind only parents can give. The room became completely silent. Then Dad kissed my forehead and said 4 simple words. I've missed you, sweetheart. Gasps echoed around the ballroom. Actual gasps. I turned slightly. David's face had gone completely pale. Vanessa looked like she'd forgotten how to blink. The realization was spreading through the room at lightning speed. People were connecting the dots. Richard Bennett. Susan Bennett. Richard Bennett's daughter. My father finally turned toward David. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Dad extended his hand. Professional. Polite. Almost friendly. David. David stared. His mouth opened. Then closed. Then opened again. No words came out. The sight would have been funny if it weren't so surreal. Eventually he managed. Mr. Bennett. Dad nodded. Good evening. David looked like a man discovering gravity for the first time. Everything he'd believed about me was collapsing. Everything he'd assumed. Everything he'd dismissed. Gone. Around us, whispers multiplied. Guests pulled out phones. People exchanged looks. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Dad remained calm. Interesting event. David swallowed hard. Sir, He had no idea where to begin. Neither would I. Then Dad delivered the sentence that changed the entire evening. My attorneys have asked me to inform you that certain documents were submitted earlier this week. David froze. The color drained further from his face. Several nearby investors immediately exchanged concerned looks. Dad continued, still calm, still polite. Financial records, loan documents, signature discrepancies. The room grew even quieter. I didn't think that was possible. Apparently it was. One investor stepped away from David. Then another. Then another. Like dominoes falling. Nobody wanted to stand too close to potential trouble. Vanessa looked back and forth between them. Confusion quickly turning into panic. What documents? Nobody answered. Dad wasn't interested in humiliating anyone. He simply stated facts. That made it far more devastating. A local developer approached one of David's business partners. Their conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. The partner immediately left. Without saying goodbye, more departures followed. A banker. An investor. A consultant. People began quietly distancing themselves. Not because Dad ordered them to. Because information changes decisions. Then came the moment nobody expected. Including me. Vanessa turned directly toward David. Wait. Her voice cut through the silence. What about the properties? David blinked. What? The developments you own. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire ballroom seemed to lean closer. Vanessa continued. The commercial properties. David looked trapped. She stared. You do own them, right? The silence that followed was almost painful. Finally, David said the worst possible thing. It's complicated. Several people laughed. Actually laughed. Not loudly, but enough. Vanessa's expression changed instantly. Everything clicked. The exaggerations. The half-truths. The promises. The image. All of it. Oh my God. She stepped backward. Then another step. Then another. I cannot believe this. David reached toward her. Vanessa. She moved away. No. The room watched. Mesmerized. Absolutely not. And just like that she left. Walked straight across the ballroom. Out the door. Gone before dessert. Karen leaned toward me. I did not have that on my bingo card. For the first time all night I laughed. A genuine laugh. Not cruel. Just honest. Because reality had become stranger than fiction. Over the next 30 minutes guests continued leaving. Quietly. Politely. But steadily. The celebration dissolved around David. No shouting. No dramatic confrontation. No revenge speech. Just truth. And the consequences that naturally followed. By 9 o'clock the ballroom was nearly empty. The engagement party was over. The engagement itself appeared to be over too. And standing alone near the center of the room was the man who once believed he controlled the story. Then he looked at me. For the first time in months there was no arrogance. No performance. No audience. Just regret. He took a slow breath. And asked the question he'd probably been dreading all evening. Susan, I waited. Can we talk? The ballroom was almost empty when David asked if we could talk. A few staff members were clearing tables. Champagne glasses clinked into plastic bins. The pianist had already packed up and left. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the golf course sat under a dark Indiana sky. For a moment I simply looked at him. This was the man I'd married. The man I'd spent 14 years building a life with. And somehow he looked older than he had just a few months earlier. Not physically. Just worn down. Like someone who had been running from consequences and finally ran out of road. Karen touched my shoulder. I'll wait outside. I nodded. Dad gave me a look that said the same thing. Whatever happened next was my decision. Not his. Not anyone else's. Mine. A few minutes later, David and I sat across from each other at a small table near the back of the ballroom. The room felt strangely quiet. Almost peaceful. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then David sighed. I don't even know where to start. I looked at him. That's probably part of the problem. A sad smile crossed his face. I deserve that. Maybe he did. But hearing it didn't give me satisfaction. Just sadness. Because once upon a time this was a conversation between two people who loved each other. Now it felt like two strangers discussing the wreckage. David rubbed his forehead. I never thought it would end like this. I almost laughed. What exactly did you think would happen? He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. No answer came. Because there wasn't one. Eventually he looked down at the table. I got greedy. The honesty surprised me. Not because it wasn't true. Because it was the first honest thing I'd heard from him in months. I kept thinking success would make me happy. I stayed quiet. He continued. The more I got, the more I wanted. His voice sounded tired. I started comparing myself to everyone. The developers who had bigger projects. The investors with larger portfolios. The executives with private jets. People who always seemed richer. More important. More successful. I felt like I was losing. I studied his face. Part of me finally understood something. This had never really been about me. Not entirely. David had been competing with people who weren't even paying attention to him. He'd built an imaginary scoreboard inside his head. And eventually he sacrificed everything trying to win a game nobody else was playing. That realization didn't excuse anything. But it explained a lot. What about Vanessa? I asked. He laughed bitterly. A short, humorless laugh. I honestly don't know. For some reason that answer felt true. Maybe he'd loved her. Maybe he'd loved the version of himself he became around her. Maybe neither. At that point, it hardly mattered. The silence stretched between us. Then David looked up. His eyes were red. Not dramatic, not theatrical. Just tired. I'm sorry, Susan. I waited. He swallowed hard. For all of it. The lies. The cheating. The humiliation. The financial mess. The gossip. Everything. I believed he meant it. That was the strange part. Months earlier, I would have given anything to hear those words. Now they felt late. Not meaningless. Just late. Because apologies can't rebuild trust once it's gone. They can acknowledge damage. They can't erase it. I folded my hands together. You know what hurts the most? David nodded slowly. What? The fact that I would have stayed. His eyes widened. If you'd come to me before all this? I looked around the nearly empty room. If you'd been honest. If you'd told me you were unhappy. If you'd told me you were struggling. I paused. We could have tried. The pain that crossed his face was immediate, because he knew I was telling the truth. We could have tried. Not guaranteed success, not guaranteed salvation. But we could have tried. Instead, he'd chosen deception. And once trust disappears, there isn't much left to build on. A few moments later, he asked a question I'd expected all evening. When were you going to tell me? I smiled slightly. About my father. He nodded. Yeah. I thought about it. The answer surprised even me. I wasn't hiding him. David frowned. I don't understand. My father being wealthy was never the important part. I looked toward the windows, toward the dark golf course beyond them. I wanted someone to love me without all of that. Without the titles, without the money, without the assumptions. For years I believed I'd found that. Maybe I had, at least in the beginning. David stared at the table. Then he laughed softly, a sad laugh. I spent years trying to become rich. His voice cracked slightly. And I was married to someone who never cared about money. Neither of us said anything after that, because there wasn't anything left to say. Eventually we stood. The conversation was over. The marriage had been over for a while. We were simply acknowledging reality. David extended his hand, then seemed embarrassed by the gesture. I surprised both of us by accepting it. One final handshake. One final goodbye. Nothing more. As I walked away, he called my name. I turned. Goodbye, Susan. I nodded. Goodbye, David. And that was the last meaningful conversation we ever had. The divorce moved forward over the following months. The legal process wasn't pleasant, but it was fair. Investigations continued regarding several financial matters. Some business relationships disappeared. Others survived. Life moved on, as life always does. Vanessa vanished from the picture almost immediately. Apparently, she discovered very quickly that reality wasn't as glamorous as the story she'd been sold. Karen joked that she left faster than a clearance item on Black Friday. That made me laugh every time. As for me, something unexpected happened. I became happy again. Not overnight. Not magically. Slowly. The way real healing happens. I started volunteering with a literacy program. Spent more time with my parents. Reconnected with old friends. Traveled. Read books. Learned how to enjoy quiet evenings without wondering who might walk through the door. Eventually, I began consulting on several charitable projects connected to my father's foundation. Not because I needed the work, because I enjoyed it. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to maintain a life. I was building one, and that felt different. Healthier. More honest. Looking back now, people often ask whether I regret keeping my family's wealth private. The answer is no. Not at all. Money doesn't create character. It reveals it. When people believe you have nothing to offer except yourself, you learn very quickly who values you for the right reasons. That lesson was painful, but it was worth learning. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that truth has a strange way of arriving exactly when it's needed. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it arrives all at once. Either way, it eventually shows up. And if you've ever had someone underestimate you, betray your trust, or mistake kindness for weakness, I hope this story reminds you that your value was never determined by their opinion. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear what you would have done in my situation.